Broken sand dollars. We've been coming to Oak Island long enough now that the place feels familiar. Not we've visited a few times familiar. More like we know exactly where we're buying groceries familiar. Every year somebody suggests trying a different store, and every year we end up at Lowe's anyway. We know that Risky Business is our favorite place to buy seafood. We know which beach access we prefer, which roads get busy, and which evenings are best spent on the porch watching the sunset. Most years, our morning walks take us toward the end of the island, where the ocean eventually meets the intercoastal waterway. By now, the week has developed its own rhythm. The same places, the same routines, the same conversations about what we're having for dinner and whether anyone remembered to bring enough beach chairs. In many ways, that's part of what I love about it, which is why I was surprised when a beach I've walked for years managed to show me something new. A few mornings ago, Mom, my brother, and I were making our usual walk when Mom stopped and picked something up. A piece of a sand dollar. A few steps later, we found another, and then another. Before long, the walk had turned into a treasure hunt. Now, to be clear, these weren't beautiful, perfectly preserved sand dollars that belonged in a souvenir shop. They were fragments, broken pieces. Most of them were only recognizable because of the distinctive pattern that remained. Yet somehow that didn't lessen our enthusiasm. Every few feet, one of us would stop and bend down to inspect something in the sand. Mom would find one, then I would find one. Then we'd both start scanning the shoreline for more. Meanwhile, my brother had become increasingly concerned about the long-term availability of sand dollars for the rest of Oak Island. After watching us collect pieces for several minutes, he finally looked at us and said, "Would you two leave some for the other beach walkers?" This seemed unlikely. The funny thing is that we weren't even looking for sand dollars. If you had asked me before that walk what we might find, I probably would have guessed shells, or maybe a piece of sea glass. Instead, 3 adults ended up wandering down the beach collecting fragments of broken sand dollars while carrying on as though we'd stumbled across buried treasure. Later, I found myself wondering why we were so excited. The pieces weren't valuable. Most weren't even complete. Yet finding them felt strangely satisfying. I think part of it had to do with the simple fact that we'd never found them there before. We've walked that same stretch of beach for years. We've looked for shells and sea glass. We've watched dolphins offshore and ships on the horizon, and wondered it in sunshine, wind, fog, and the occasional weather conditions that probably should have convinced us to stay inside. Yet somehow, after all these years, we'd never noticed broken sand dollars. Or perhaps we'd never seen them. I'm not entirely sure which. What I do know is that the experience has stayed with me. Maybe it's because the older I get, the more I realize how often familiarity causes us to stop looking. Once we've been somewhere enough times, we assume we've seen everything there is to see. Once we've heard a story often enough, we assume we already know it. Once something becomes familiar, we stop expecting it to surprise us. I've noticed myself doing the same thing with Scripture. There are passages I've read so many times that I can almost recite them from memory. Stories I've heard since childhood. Verses I've underlined, memorized, listened to in sermons, and read again during countless quiet mornings. It would be easy to assume there is nothing left to discover. Yet every so often I'll come across a passage I've read dozens of times and find myself stopping. Not because the words changed. Not because God added something new to the page. More often, I think it's because I arrived differently than I did before. Life has a way of changing what we notice. A passage about grief reads differently after you've buried someone you love. A passage about provision reads differently after you've walked through uncertainty. A passage about forgiveness reads differently after you've needed it yourself. The story remains the same, but we don't. The older we get, the more experiences we carry with us, and sometimes those experiences illuminate parts of a familiar passage that we simply weren't ready to see before. I've come to think that's one of the gifts of returning. Returning to places, returning to people, returning to traditions, returning to Scripture. Not because they have changed, because we have. The beach was still Oak Island. Lowe's was still crowded. Risky business was still selling seafood. The tide was still moving in and out exactly as it always had. Nothing about the island was dramatically different. And yet this year, on an ordinary morning walk, Mom and I found ourselves ridiculously excited about broken sand dollars, while my brother worried about preserving them for future generations. Honestly, that may be my favorite part of the story. Not the sand dollars themselves, but the reminder that familiar things still have surprises left in them. A favorite beach, a family tradition, a well-worn Bible. The places and stories we think we know best often have more depth than we realize. Sometimes, all it takes is another walk down the same shoreline to discover what was there all along.